The sun rises as the protagonist leaves the house, visually marking the beginning of his journey given to him by Buzz. If the player attempts to return home first, they're met with the Photo Man. Officially, the Photo Man is a character from the saved future sent by the protagonist himself to help remember his adventure, not having taken photos along the way, which is why he seemingly drops in from the sky to take these photos. He's a symbol for memories explicitly, and a physical metaphor for the good times, the memories we all wish we could relive, the simpler times, despite the scale of this adventure. The camera's shutter becomes a filter around the screen to convey this as a memory for the player to fondly look back on as well. By returning to the mother, the player is taught that resting restores both their HP and PP, which they'll soon also learn is very generous to be receiving for free. The player remembers Liar exaggerates requests from earlier. They'll start making their way up the mountain. By reaching his house, they'll notice he's not there, the door finally being opened, enticing them to enter. After entering Liar's house, they'll be taken through a short scene in which he reveals a treasure he's uncovered, the Manny Manny statue, its melody giving off threatening vibes. Liar also acts odd, getting slightly hostile towards the protagonist and projecting his thoughts the statue's already infecting him with, foreshadowing the statue's effect on others later. The scene is rather obscured, as many players might forget about this moment, but those who are keen and took note will be rewarded with some enriching of the story. Though it's still a shame it's likely many players, probably even a majority of them, have never seen it, as it's a pretty important story beat. The statue's Oscar statuette-like form promises of fame and fortune, and its horns invoke imagery of the gold calf from the Bible, again drawing on historical and traditional stories to implant mixed and nervous feelings into the player. On their way back, the player may run into a coil snake, which if they're strong enough will run away, enticing players to chase after it, triggering the insta-win system. This moment teaches the player that enemies significantly weaker than themselves will run from them and automatically be defeated if pursued. Many have said it before, so I won't dwell on it, but this feature is way ahead of its time, and even to this day, as most RPGs now don't even have this feature. The closest features I've seen have come in the form of speeding up like an emulator to make grinding go faster. This mechanic was an idea of Shigeru Miyamoto's, who played very few RPGs himself, the original Mother even being the first one he had completed, and suggested this idea to cut down on repeated battles. This feature's genius, and is again a sign of the game's respect for the player, in a time where every type of game had no reservations about wasting your time. EarthBound made a huge step in the right direction for the genre, though many still refuse to pick up on it due to the massive reduction of playtime it would create. It's simple, understandable, and fun. With all of that out of the way, it's time for the player to finally enter the larger world, the game world opening up with the sun rising, a perfect visual metaphor. Following the path, the player is naturally led to the Onett public library, and the nearby PC informs the player that the library has information on EarthBound, and maps for free. The librarian gives them one and quickly and funnily explains the function, short and sweet, and by opening the map is shown the town of Onett, with some notable locations marked out for them to try, two being at the bottom to subtly lead the player toward the arcade, where Frank is. Here the player will also see the library works as a sort of actual library to them, many of the NPCs outright explaining core mechanics of the game. But this building is kept completely optional, so I'm totally good with this, seeing as it's completely unobtrusive to those uninterested. The text here is all well written too, and gives character to the NPCs, as well as making the information's importance clear, like this girl who explains hotels, HP and PP, and says she's trying to memorize these rules for a test, and bets they'll be on it, very subtly implying this information will be important to success. This guy says nothing. This guy foreshadows the boss of Giant Step in a funny, lighthearted way, showing the player that they should be aware of this, but it's not pressing, as that's not until much later. The Shy Guy doesn't say anything, but acts as a setup to a side story we'll be revisiting in the future. These two explain ATMs and which phones cost money or not. Told very casually, as this information is important but will be taught in other ways, and it's inevitable to be encountered naturally. This NPC explains magic butterflies in a very lavish way, emphasizing their usefulness to the player, and repeats the word butterfly several times to bang it into the player's head so they'll pop out to them when they're encountered. This NPC gives the player clear directions to the Giant Step, which clearly points them towards their next stop. There's also a funny scene outside this room involving the restrooms, and just adds some flavor to the life of the setting, and is just there for the player to enjoy, and be made to feel more comfortable. With the information of the Giant Step's location, the player will head northwest from the library. Quickly they'll encounter this NPC, who channels the image of the Peanuts Pigpen, clearly conveying him to be a young rascal. He tells the player about a secret hideout, which if the player remembers seeing earlier in the game, will be rewarded by knowing to go through the woods to get to it. However, the player is also led to be inclined to go to this area by this barren piece of the woods, which sticks out from the surrounding trees. This draws the player to here, and brings the house into view, cueing the player to head up to it. There is another way for the player to be led here though, which we'll get to later. The characters in the clubhouse are reminiscent of The Little Rascals, a series which is referenced several times in the game, and gives Onett a more small-town atmosphere, making it feel more homey. Especially important as it is the protagonist's home, and its smaller scale will make the grander places he reaches that much more grand in the future. Continuing northwest, the player will encounter this mole, who will explicitly explain the battle swirls, but again is left completely optional, which I approve of. I appreciate the game letting itself be both subtle with its design and loud with it simultaneously, allowing for differently experienced players to tailor their experience more to their playstyle and abilities. After this, the player will be led to the Traveling Entertainer Shack, where they'll learn it's locked, that somebody at City Hall has the key, and somebody named Frank is responsible, as well as some mystique about the giant step itself. With that, the player is led to entering the town of Onett. At its entrance, the player will be drawn to the garbage can, as it simply is made obvious to check by its resemblance to the gift box, where they'll find a hamburger, teaching that presents can come in many different forms. This NPC is also placed at the entrance, immediately making it clear that the arcade is the current location of interest. The burger shop and the drugstore are placed directly next to the garbage can, filtering the player right into them. These locations will teach the player mechanics of buying and selling items, and that generally more expensive equals better is not a bad rule to follow. Their layouts are very intuitive, as again, they're modeled to look like actual places, making them easy to understand visually. This character urges the protagonist to call their mom, and even if the player doesn't see this, will be given the option, and seeing as they haven't up to this point, will be inclined to call anyway, simply to see what it does, opening the Escargot Express for item storage. I like Tracy's interaction here, as it again invokes the essence of the Peanuts with kids owning businesses and such. I'm not a big fan of the Escargot Express though, as it's tedious to have to wait for the delivery pickup man every time you call, pay him, and then only be able to store 3 items at a time for some reason. It's not a big deal now, but becomes a very inconvenient practice and annoying later in the game. These shops also act as substitutes for the library NPCs as ways of teaching the player how they work, with them being pretty small, keeping peddlers and clerks behind the counters, and making the ATM stick out to teach the player to deposit and withdraw money. This is why most of the items in the drugstore are more expensive than the maximum $20 the player is probably carrying, as well as why the drugstore with the more useful items is placed after the burger shop, to drain the player's funds to lead them to the ATM. I just wish the connection that defeating enemies triggers the father to deposit money into the protagonist's bank account was made more clear, as new players might think just simply wandering around will cause it. Onett is very purposefully laid out like a sort of funnel design-wise, starting the player with the stores that pose no threat, leading them to the hotel where things get more expensive, and finally to the bottom layer with the tough enemies, easing them into it. The flashing item system is helpful, but sadly not incredibly clear initially. When contrasted with items the player sees that there's a weapon a character cannot equip, it's much more understandable, but since those aren't in this store, it's a bit less clear. Though this potential confusion is combated by the choice to place Ruffini in the store to explain this, as the player will be drawn to him since he sticks out, being a dog in a store. The store also introduces different types of weapons, like the yo-yo, other types of armor, and upgrades to weapons like the T-ball bat, which showcases the flashing window feature. Continuing left, since that's where the player's been led so far, they'll come into contact with this NPC, who mentions the female protagonist as being special and living in Tucson, which will catch the eyes and ears of players, as seeing the name they input will jump out at them and make Tucson another location of interest. There's some sweet sentimental text on this sign to put the player in the mindset of small town life, and this branch on the path will show players that some areas connect from different locations of other places. Going along with Onett's funnel layout, the player is led in sort of a zigzag pattern, and it's brought along a sort of invisible path like this. This NPC tells you about City Hall, this one reiterates the female protagonist's importance and introduces her as a PSI user, this old lady will explain hospitals, and this guy gives some sort of cryptic dialogue to a new player, honestly. The intention is that the monster is controlling the sharks, but a new player might be led to believe they should be looking for Frank by Giant Step. Though I think the arcade is mentioned enough and Onett is small enough to prevent this from being a major misstep. If the player attempts to see the mayor, they're reinformed about the sharks and are escorted out, indicating that in order for them to see the mayor to open the shack, they'll need to take care of the sharks. This is reinforced by that if the player attempts to leave, they'll hit another roadblock. The sharks themselves are a reference to the gang from the musical and film West Side Story, and easily convey them to be dangerous, being named after sharks and all. So the connection is clear regardless of the player's familiarity with the source material. The player is then brought to the Onett hotel, which, thanks to many indications already given, they'll understand the importance of, as well as there being a free black phone to use, teaching the player that hotels are the location to save at. Heading down, the player will see Frank behind the arcade, and will be drawn to his color contrast from the green grass, his red suit even complementing it. The Frankenstein Mark II is also visible, but purposely obscured by the bush and meant to somewhat blend in with the fence behind it, to introduce a mystique to the player of what it could be. This NPC even spells out that it's Frank. The sharks themselves outside the arcade will intrigue the player due to their drastically different look from other NPCs, but the player won't necessarily know they'll engage in a battle since these ones don't pursue the player. With the battle starting upon talking to one of them, the player is introduced to humans as enemies. And oh boy, do these guys teach you so much more. Early game, these guys are tough, and show the player enemies can call others into battle, and most importantly, that the player needs items to survive. It's not unlikely that the player will get their first game over here, which might teach some players the importance of saving, and all players that they need to hit up the shop. On their repeat visit, the player will also notice they've lost half of their funds, showing the player that they shouldn't carry more than necessary on hand. This second visit will also show players the importance of different armor, and that raising their defense reduces their damage taken from enemies. However, the area is surrounded by enough easier enemies that the player can quickly overcome the more difficult ones and acquire their money back. In the arcade, the player is naturally drawn to this shark as he's blocking a door, which is understood to be the way to Frank by the layout of the outside. After defeating the shark and exiting to Frank, by engaging in a battle with him, his theme samples Chuck Berry's 1950s rock song, Johnny Be Good, a song chosen purposely for its recognizability and as one of the most iconic songs in all of rock and roll. The song itself is an autobiographical piece about Barry, and the narrative describes a country boy who may one day become famous with his music. Not only is this rebellious rock and roll sound perfect for Frank's clear inspiration from that time period's greasers, but the narrative itself is somewhat reflective of the protagonist's own journey, coming from the outskirts of his hometown and beginning his journey to save the world. Funny enough, this also sets a precedent in-game for the use of samples in battles, and actually does so with a song that itself samples. Barry's song sampling the intro guitar riff from R&B artist Louis Jordan's 1946 song, Ain't That Just Like a Woman. Frank is able to lower the player's gut stat by saying something nasty, which is fun and in character, but I do wish the player was made aware of what this stat actually does to feel the significance of this. I also appreciate that the protagonist's gut stat dropping because of something Frank says being reminiscent of losing one's nerve to fight, similar to the street culture of greasers in the 1950s. Frank also uses knives, much like the common switchblades used as weapons by these groups. After defeating him, the player is then thrust into battle with the Frankenstein Mark II, an obvious play on the title of the novel by Mary Shelley. The boss alternates between attacking the player and generating a burst of steam, and notably begins with the latter, an intentional choice so players who barely scrape by Frank will have an opportunity to restore their HP so they don't feel overwhelmed by a second phase they weren't prepared for, which is considered of the designers in the early game. Alternatively, if the player does lose to this phase of the fight, they can begin right at this section of it, also consider it, and a rare instance of this happening at all in the game. One last thing to note about this battle is how it starts the trend of the game using different words depending on the enemy you're fighting, using words like defeated or phrases like became tame for organic enemies, while mechanical ones are destroyed, or the like. It's a small touch, but does give some different tones depending on what you're fighting, and reiterates the separation between nature and machine. After the battle concludes, Frank tells the protagonist more about Giant Step, and weirdly mentions that it allows certain people to perform wondrous feats, which I think is meant to refer to the power it gives the protagonist internally, him combining his strength with the earth and such, but if this is the case, why can other people do it? Otherwise, what is meant by wondrous feats? It makes me think of how Lucas learns a new form of PK love after pulling a needle in Mother 3, but no sort of equivalent to this is in EarthBound, so this line just strikes me as odd. This line does explain, however, that the Sanctuary Guardians are significantly stronger than other enemies because they're absorbing the power of these spots, which explains why many of them resemble enemies in the surrounding area. A nice touch. This also explains why the protagonist physically changes over the course of the game. Not only is he getting stronger through all his work, but is also changing because of how the Sanctuary locations are affecting him on a physical level. Frank then mentions the mayor, reminding the player to visit him, and with that, the sharks are an issue no more. When returning through the arcade, a shark stops you and says nothing but an ominous, "Yeah," and is on his way. And I think this makes the arcade pretty unsettling. Nothing but resentment, and the mechanical arcade sounds in the now much emptier building is both sad and unwelcoming. Upon returning to Town Hall, the game offers some filler dialogue for some NPCs, but I appreciate its political satire, as even if it's not contributing to the game on a story level, it's continuing to fill the world in a natural way. With that, the player receives the key to the shack. I like that when leaving the office that the receptionist text changes to, "You look like someone who's gonna do something big." It's something to warm the player's heart, to make them go, "Aw, little ol' me." It's also nice that the game gives players a new free healing spot with Frank. But I wish its existence was made a bit more clear, as there's not really any reason a player would be inclined to return to him, and I don't think this is intended to be a secret. To the south of town, there's this little girl in front of a sign who has this funny line about someone, you, saying check-a-rooney when checking signs. I really like this NPC because she teaches players who are paying attention a helpful lesson, one that could make something later much easier to understand, which we'll get to much later. Anyway, she says this, and the only way to read the sign next to her is to use the check command, as simply pressing L will cause you to talk to her. It's a cool way the game shows you sometimes check opportunities will be obscured, and there is actually utility to them being separate commands. A garbage can to the east of Town Hall is also noteworthy, as it has nothing but plain old trash. I find this clever because the first one you ever see has a helpful recovery item in it, so the player will instinctively check them from then on, expecting items. It's like a joke told through gameplay, which is something I can only recall seeing maybe a few times in my entire gaming experience. Some other NPCs to appreciate as well include a boy in a hat who reminds the player to see, lie, or exaggerate, which I wish was reiterated a bit more as it's an important piece of story information, and a parent who won't leave their house but mentions the secret hideout again, a slightly clearer hint at where to get the Mr. Baseball cap. There's also the Hint Man. As much as I believe the game to lead the player along, it still will help out struggling players, at a literal cost. $35 seems like a good amount to me for this point in the game, as it's not an impossible amount to come by, but it is a bit of money as of now, so it does incentivize players already struggling to seek out their own answers. I also adore that his stand is a clear allusion to Lucy's psychiatry stand from the Peanuts, sort of calling attention to the hokiness of it. The NPC in the house next door even seems to poke fun at the concept, but in a way that won't make a struggling player feel bad, but maybe even laugh when they enter the Hint Man's house after seeing it. The use of creepier music is also great, as it helps build up the mysteriousness of what'll help you in the next house, making the payoff even better. Making their way back to the shack and opening the door, the player will now finally be able to enter the giant step dungeon. By talking to the entertainer after doing this, they'll thank the protagonist and give him a travel charm, an item that warns the player of ailments they'll encounter down the road. But this is admittedly an odd place for this, as paralysis isn't something that'll be encountered for a long time. It does allow for the player to fill every equipment slot though, which also admittedly does make you feel even more powerful, a good feeling to give a player before they enter their biggest challenge yet. By walking through the house, the player is brought to the other side of the fence. Mixed with its "Don't Enter" sign, this visualizes the separation the player is now entering from the rest of the world, indicative of foes who will be more nature or sci-fi based than the ones in town. The sci-fi elements are reiterated by this area's music, which reincorporates many of the alien aesthetics of Alien Invasion 1, which plays during the game's opening. One of the enemies the player will encounter here is the Rowdy Mouse, who serves wholly as an outlet to inform the player's enemies too can deal smash attacks in case they haven't encountered them yet. The player will quickly learn the impending danger of fighting them, and can find a skip sandwich which will give them an opportunity to slip by them if they're skilled enough. There's also a cave to the left, which leads to nothing. Some might see this as a beginner's trap that'll result in inexperienced players to accidentally spawn more battles, but I don't see this necessarily as a bad thing. Number 1, this is on the first floor of a short dungeon, so it's not much of a setback even if they die. And 2, if more enemies are spawned, said inexperienced players will be given more opportunities for experience points, resulting in them becoming stronger faster, helping them to thrive in the long run. Regardless, I see this cave leading to nothing as a direction for the player to head up the rope, as it may be unclear at a glance what it is, and shows that dungeons won't be as simple as left and right. Around this dungeon, the player will likely reach at least level 8. With the amount of experience enemies leading up to this point give, this is the level the protagonist will learn their special move, the PK attack they unknowingly named at the beginning of the game. When this happens, the player will immediately be drawn to it, as it's named after what they input. At the very least, because it's what they said their favorite thing was. The game plans for this moment, and it wants you to learn about it now, which is why it provides you with swarms of weaker enemies that are hard to outrun. And if the player puts off using it, they'll be reminded when they eventually open up the PSI menu, as the game places this move as the first option seen when it's pulled up, and by using it, it's shown the move provides large amounts of spread damage to multiple targets, proving to be immensely useful, both against swarms and the tougher individual enemies. This also shows the more useful a move, the more PP it will cost. This is all very intuitive to the player, and they'll want to use it on big groups, as they already understand it means for a bigger XP yield. However, these swarms are also kept very weak, so players who haven't reached this level yet still have the ability to grow stronger quickly. It's perfect. Another cave holds a cold remedy, another healing item, and one I think is better suited to the area than the travel charm, as it's not unreasonable to think a player might have this by the time they reach cold inflicting enemies, but it still seems a bit early to me. Reaching the top exit to the cave, the player is brought to a safe room that houses a magic butterfly. Being outside lets the player breathe a little bit before continuing. It's nice, and this moment gives an ample opportunity to grind if they'd like to, since the magic butterfly responds, which will be gauged by how difficult they found the first half of the dungeon. It's also made clear that this is the halfway point, as the visuals of the cliffs clearly indicate this. So there, players are taught they'll be given relatively safe zones to rest at around the halfway point of a dungeon. Players intimidated by the enemies that were intending on trekking back down to get more items or something might turn around and be taught of the respawning butterfly trick as well. And this is good, as the mechanic was intentional, and I know this because Toy himself used it when playing the game on a live stream, and it's encouraged by the player's guide. Reaching the end of the dungeon, the player is brought to a room with no way to go but up. I love this, as the long ropes let the player mentally prepare for what's coming next, as experienced ones already know a boss is coming because of the formulas for game design, and inexperienced ones have been told there's a strong enemy guarding the sanctuary location, so players alike know something is coming through either gameplay, story, or both. At the top of the ropes, you're met with a shining star. I love the ambiguousness of its appearance. It continues building the suspense before the battle starts. Starting the battle, the protagonist faces off with the Titanic Ant and its cohorts. The player is encouraged to use their custom move here, as there's an understanding the Titanic Ant is a powerful foe, so they'll be led to take out the minions as soon as possible. Here the player will also likely encounter the boss's PSI magnet, showing that their PP isn't even safe. This encourages the player to quickly expend it on their own terms before it's too late. The Titanic Ant's moveset also begins to introduce debuffs with defense down. It's not an overly complex fight, but it's a good introduction to these types of battles, as well as a test of all the knowledge the player's been equipped with up to this point. This moment gives a great sense of accomplishment to the player, awarding them with loads of experience on top of completing the first section of the game. The sheer amount of experience is practically guaranteed to give them a level up too. This moment is pure euphoria for the early game. The sprite also having a different fading animation after the battle is also a nice touch, feels more theatrical. This moment is followed up by a seamless transition into the Giant Step Sanctuary. The change in music allows for the player to come down from their high as they take in that they've finally reached the location they've been constantly reminded of for the last hour or so. By approaching it, they receive their first melody. The subduing of the music so that the melody takes prominence emphasizes its importance, and the way the last note leaves an oral cliffhanger leaves a sort of longing and incomplete feeling inside the player and encourages them to continue collecting them. Text then comes up saying the protagonist saw a vision of a small, cute puppy. In the moment, it invokes a sense of the happy place the sanctuary brings the protagonist to, but in the long term is setting up a revelation for the player to experience along with the protagonist much further down the road. Leaving the sanctuary, the player is allowed to continue enjoying their victory lap, as they'll see once a sanctuary guardian is defeated, all other enemies inhabiting a dungeon will run from them. Leaving the dungeon, a police officer will encounter the player, telling them to come to the police station for trespassing, and in a typo it says do not enter, when in actuality it says, oh, never mind, I guess it does say that. Heading there, you'll talk to the police chief, and you'll be led into one of the most controversial moments in the entire game. The protagonist is then attacked by 5 police officers, one runs away, consecutively. Many people draw different things from this, but in terms of a literal story perspective, I believe this moment is intended to make the player feel unsafe, as it shows even those intended to do good can and will turn against you, and truly makes it clear nobody's above Gygas's evil influence. These are also tough battles, so the enemies running away from you in the Giant Step dungeon come just in time so the players can easily grind to eventually be able to beat them. Though not played overly dark, the moment is incredibly disturbing, and shows how little of an impact has actually been made so far, as not even the town we've saved is truly saved. By defeating the law enforcement, the chief finally opens up the roads for you to head to Tucson. Heading south, we reach the house of the exit mice, who act as an emergency exit for a dungeon. It's helpful and completely optional, so only those who think they'll need it get it, and those daring enough to go without one have one more free inventory space. Further south, there's a present with a hamburger in it. I like this, as it's a welcome item, as the player likely used many of theirs fighting the police force, and it also directly parallels the hamburger the player gets right at the beginning of Onett, letting them look how far they've already come on their adventure. The player will then encounter a new enemy, the Ramblin' Evil Mushroom. They're not too tough, and oh look, there's a mushroom on my head. That's probably nothing. We'll deal with that later. Now at the end of the outskirts of Onett, let's head into the next area.